Hi, I'm reading through the book Why the Church of the Nazarene Should Be Fully LGBTQ Affirming. We're in chapter 87, Sometimes What You Say Gets in the Way of What You Mean, by Kevin M. Talbert. The chapter description reads, The cultural message of the Nazarene Church's stance on LGBTQ issues undermines God's mandate to love the vulnerable. The chapter continues. The church is a cultural institution as much as it is a theological one. If this were not true, the Christians would have no part in culture war politics, and there would be little meaning or little to debate in the Christian aphorism to be in the world but not of the world. No doubt those in the Church of the Nazarene who would advocate against LGBTQ people as full members of the church community do so, at least in part, out of a desire to protect the church from outside cultural influence they perceive to be undermining the church's theological grounding. While understandable, I find this effort misguided and ultimately hurtful. Indeed, it is easy to think of any church as itself having a culture, whether one thinks of their local congregation or more broadly of the church universal. Ministers and congregants alike often speak of the culture of the church with words like welcoming or contemporary or relevant to the culture. Yes, even describing the church as affirming, as the authors in this volume advocate, is a comment about the desired culture of the church. Culture is, in large part, formative. It helps educate people about how to be and how to live in a particular context. In that sense, culture has a pedagogical aspect. That is, it teaches people the symbols and meanings needed to successfully navigate life in a community. Consequently, one may understand the culture of a given community as a sort of text that is both written and interpreted by the members of the community as well as those outside the community. These cultural messages are a form of curriculum that help people to learn whether they belong in a community and how to belong. Cultural texts are informed and shaped not just by the local context, but also by broader, more widespread contexts. In this way, then, the church exists not just as a culture, but within a larger culture that includes its own texts, its own symbols, and meanings that shape people's understanding of the world. And the culture of the church is shaped within and through cultural understanding from the wider society. Thus, when the church takes a stance about a particular cultural issue, much less a theological one, it is also performing an educational function. That is, we can take the church's stance on any particular issue as a sort of curriculum that teaches both its members and the culture at large about the church, its priorities, and especially its vision of who God is and the work, it contends, He does in the world. This cultural educational effect of the church is also implicated with relations of power. That is, the church as an institution manifests power in the world, at least the power to determine what, and therefore who, is acceptable and good in God's sight, and what or who is not. What a weighty role! In a real sense, the cultural messages the church sends not only communicates messages about a given issue, but communicate that the church claims power as the primary arbiter of God's authority in and over the world. When the church includes certain people and excludes others from the sacraments, from its rituals and practices, from its leadership, it is exercising power with potentially eternal consequences in people's lives. It is also denying people friendship, community, even livelihoods. I dare say these are often felt in people's lives in a more real and potent way than they feel any eternal consequence, whether we like that or not. My wife and I left the Nazarene Church in part because of its refusal to acknowledge its cultural power and especially to use its cultural power affirmatively on the side of the vulnerable in the community. It chose instead to rest in platitudes about loving everyone equally and staying above the fray, which, in effect, suggested a curricular message that those who were being harmed were to have no refuge in that church. It taught my wife and I that that congregation was willing to ignore Christ's mandate to protect the vulnerable if it meant not being controversial. Sadly, this means it was willing to use its power to sacrifice on the altar of unity those who needed the affirmative, active protection of a loving community willing to risk itself on their behalf. LGBTQ people in the United States continue to be among the most vulnerable to discrimination, harassment, and premature death, whether by suicide, murder, or the cumulative effects of stress of trying to survive in a society that hates their existence. I support the full affirmation of LGBTQ+ people within the Church of the Nazarene. I do so because I believe God loves LGBTQ+ people with the same reckless love that He has for me, a straight, cisgender person and a sinner. I urge the Nazarene Church to fully and publicly affirm LGBTQ+ people. I believe not doing so communicates a cultural text that undermines the Church's theological position. That is, the cultural message received by those inside and especially outside the Church is that they are not welcome in God's kingdom since they are not fully welcomed in God's earthly community. I believe this cultural text subverts any theological message coming from the Church, such as the common saying that God loves LGBTQ+ people even as He abhors their sin. My formation in the Wesleyan tradition leads me to believe that God loves through their sin, which I take to have a double meaning. God loves people by looking beyond their sin, not ignoring it, but seeing the person for more than just their sin. And, perhaps more importantly, God's love is restorative, it is healing, it moves people beyond their sin into redemption. As a denomination, the Church of the Nazarene's message of love should be unambiguous, and the Church should use its cultural power to demonstrate in concrete and material ways to the world, and especially to all those most vulnerable in our society, that God loves them first, last, and always. Dr. Kevin M. Talbert, Ph.D., is Associate Professor of Education at the College of Idaho, where he teaches courses in curriculum studies at the Sociocultural Foundations of Education. Educated in a United Methodist Church and a UMC-affiliated college, he and his family now attend a Nazarene church in Nampa, Idaho. Well, Dr. Talbert, Kevin, thank you so much for your essay. I wanted to write in here, culture equals an unwritten policy. I think that sums up a little bit here what you mean. And even though we have tried to make the policy that is unwritten more fleshed out, we doubled down on the ambiguity at our last General Assembly, and we have so many questions to ask that are left unanswered. And I do hope that our orthodoxy and orthopraxy can mirror the love of God in the world through each of its members. So thank you so much for your contributing essay.